The night air was still, heavy with a quiet that pressed against my chest. I remember driving down the old country highway, the tires humming softly against cracked asphalt. Fog drifted across the roadside like fingers brushing the grass, and the trees leaned in, whispering in shadows. Every mile seemed to stretch longer, and a faint flicker of a distant light danced along the horizon, impossible to place. My headlights barely reached past the curve ahead, and I swore I could hear a soft rustling in the empty fields. Then, as I slowed near a lonely farmhouse, a glow unlike any I had seen hovered above the tree line, pale, pulsating, and impossibly still. I wanted to look away, but something kept me rooted to the wheel, heart thudding in quiet panic. And then, just as the fog swallowed a whole, I saw it. The highway was empty. Thick fog clung to the trees, swallowing the yellow lines beneath my tires. It was past midnight. Cold had seeped into the cabin, brushing my arms through the fabric of my jacket. The headlights cut narrow paths into the mist. Shadows twisted along the roadside. Something in the movement felt deliberate, like the darkness itself was watching. A hum began beneath the car, low, metallic, vibrating through my chest. I pressed my foot a little harder on the pedal, but it didn't fade. It stayed, constant, patient. Through the fog, a pale light appeared. At first, I thought it was a reflection from a road sign, but it moved, slowly, against the wind. It drifted above the trees, like it didn't belong to this world. I swallowed hard. The air inside the car had thickened, tasted of damp metal and cold leather. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the fog, but my skin prickled. My own breath sounded loud in the stillness. The hum pulsed, and with it, the shadows seemed to lean closer. The tree line quivered under a light that didn't belong. Rustling, soft footsteps along the shoulder, or maybe only in my imagination. I kept my eyes forward, but the corners of my vision felt crowded. The light flickered, fainter than brighter, as if it was breathing. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the road behind me seemed darker, almost too dark, like the fog had swallowed the stars themselves. I pressed my hands against the steering wheel. Cold, sticky, real. Each vibration of the hum made the metal shiver in my fingertips. I could hear it even over the engine, over the tires brushing gravel. A shadow passed the edge of the headlights. Too large to be an animal, too deliberate to be a tree branch. I forced my gaze away, telling myself I was imagining shapes in the fog. But the hum grew louder, not in my ears, but through my chest. It filled the space between the seats, slithering over my skin, crawling into my bones. The light moved closer. Not a car, not a drone, not anything I could name. It hovered just above the road, skimming over the treetops, and it felt like it was watching me back. Silence came suddenly. The hum stopped. The tires rolled over wet asphalt, but the world felt paused. I couldn't hear my own heartbeat. I could only hear the fog breathing. A flicker at the corner of my eye. Something shifted in the rear-view mirror. I turned, slowly. Nothing. Just darkness pressing against the glass. The car seemed smaller. The fog seemed heavier. My hands tightened around the wheel, but the hum started again, soft this time, almost coaxing. It seemed to move with me, matching every slight change in speed, every tilt of the road. The light dipped behind the trees, then emerged again, higher, moving faster, like it was testing boundaries, like it was curious. I slowed, paused, the tires barely making a sound on the wet road. I didn't breathe. I didn't want to alert whatever was out there to my presence. The shadows curled closer, leaning across the lines, staining the edges of the fog. Something hovered in the periphery of my vision, just beyond understanding. And then it retreated. The light rose and disappeared into the fog. The hum faded. Only the car's engine remained, gentle, mechanical, nothing unnatural. I exhaled without realizing. The road stretched ahead, silent, empty, indifferent, but the unease lingered. Like an echo behind my ribs, a whisper in the fog that I wasn't alone. I drove on, and I knew, in the quiet heartbeat between the lights, that I would never look at a lonely road the same way again. The road was narrower here. Trees pressed close on either side, their needles scratching the car's roof. It smelled of damp earth and cold pine. The radio crackled. Static filled the cabin, low and insistent, humming through the air. I reached to turn it down. The hum stayed. Soft, whispering, like the forest itself was trying to speak. Lights glimmered between the pines, too orderly to be stars. They blinked in patterns that felt deliberate. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just a fog. The tires rolled over dead leaves. A rustling answered them. Something moved just beyond the reach of the headlights. Shapes shifting in the dark. I thought I saw a shadow pause, then stretch, then vanish. The air grew colder. It settled in my throat, made my breath fog against the windshield. Curiosity pulled at me, even as the unease wrapped tighter around my chest. The static changed pitch, soft at first, then sharper like nails along metal. The lights in the trees shimmered, waving as if trying to reach me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Branches brushed the car, scraping against the metal with wet, dead friction. The smell of pine sap, mixed with something faintly burnt, filled the air. Shapes moved again, just outside the beams of light, but always retreating when I tried to focus. The road dipped into a hollow. Fog pooled in the low spaces, thick and cold, and the static became almost a whisper. It seemed to crawl under my skin, and I realized I could feel it more than hear it. I slowed. The lights between the trees formed a line, marching along a path I couldn't see. I leaned forward, hand resting on the wheel, listening to the quiet breathing of the forest around me. A branch fell. I jumped. It wasn't close, but in the silence that followed, it felt like the forest had exhaled. The static lingered, stubborn and patient. I realized it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was everywhere. Something shifted in the corner of my vision. A shape, pale, leaning from tree to tree, its movement unnaturally smooth. I blinked. It vanished. The lights remained, unwavering, as if nothing had moved at all. I wanted to leave. I wanted to speed, to escape, but the road ahead was swallowed by fog. I had no idea where I was, and still, my eyes traced the pale lights. My ears leaned into hum, drawn forward by some small, foolish curiosity. The forest was alive with tiny movements. Branches quivered. Leaves whispered against each other. The hum pulsed gently, and the shapes lingered just beyond the headlights. Never near enough to touch, never far enough to ignore. I felt breath on my neck. Not mine. A chill that slid down my spine. Quiet, deliberate. I exhaled slowly, but the air didn't warm. It only carried more of the forest breath. The lights flickered once, then vanished. The static softened, fading into low, endless murmurs. Shadows clung to the tree trunks, rustling softly, as if the forest itself was settling down. The air was still, but I knew the shapes were still there, watching, waiting, patient. I drove on. The hollow faded behind me, but the hum remained, quiet, coaxing, and I knew that the forest would not forget I had passed through it. The cornfield stretched wider than I expected. Tall stalks swayed even without wind, brushing against each other with a wet, rustling hiss. The fog hovered low, thick and cold, clinging to my clothes and hair. Lights hovered above the rows. Pale, unnatural, not like lanterns, not like stars. They moved slowly, drifting against the mist, casting shadows that bent in ways that didn't make sense. Each step forward sank into damp earth. The smell of wet soil and decaying leaves rose, rich and heavy. My boots made soft, squelching prints, but the silence around me felt alive, waiting. I paused, a flicker in the corner of my eye. The shadows stretched long across the ground, bending toward me. Something shifted within them. Then I saw them. Eyes, glowing, unblinking orbs scattered among the stalks. They didn't move, but they watched. Every instinct told me to run, but curiosity held me in place. Frozen. The corn whispered, not with wind, not with leaves, but soft brushing, like something breathing between the stalks. I could smell damp corn husks and faintly coppery soil, mixed with the static hum that I thought I had left behind. I stepped deeper. The fog thickened, brushing my arms, my neck. The eyes stayed, unmoving, patient, watching. A shadow passed close. I turned, heart slowing, but there was nothing but fog and stalks bending just enough to seem alive. The lights above shifted with an almost deliberate rhythm, hovering, dipping, then rising again. My hands brushed against the stalks. Wet, rough, cold. Each step made a soft, sucking sound in the mud. I felt the eyes tracing me with every movement, and a creeping thought settled in my chest. I was no longer alone. I slowed to a crawl. The corn pressed closer, thicker than it had any right to be. The fog swallowed the lower stalks, leaving only the pale lights and glowing orbs suspended in the mist. Breath caught in my throat. A long, low rustle came from behind me. I froze. The hum returned faintly, vibrating underfoot. The eyes reflected it somehow, brightening slightly with each pulse. I could feel them all around me, lying along the rows, waiting in the dark. I lifted a hand to touch one. The stalks resisted. Cold, wet, unyielding. I imagined hundreds of pairs of unblinking eyes staring through me, and the fog seemed to lean in heavier, breathing down my neck. The lights above dipped closer to the tops of the corn, not threatening, not moving fast, but deliberate. Each step made the eyes shift slightly, as if nudging me along a path I could not see. I tried to whisper. Nothing came out, only my shallow breaths and the soft rustling of stalks around me. The cornfield seemed endless, but the fog gave the illusion that I had gone far enough, trapped between the earth and the hovering lights. Finally, I stopped. The mud underfoot was cold. The air smelled of wet corn and fog, thick in my lungs. The eyes remained unblinking, patient. The lights floated above, steady, like lanterns held by something unseen. I didn't move for a long time, only breathed, only listened to the faint hum under the soil and the soft, deliberate brushing of the corn. And somewhere deep in the mist, I felt their gaze linger, even as I turned and finally stepped back toward the edge of the field. The fog swallowed the light slowly as I retreated. The corn whispered behind me, as if sharing secrets it would not speak aloud. I knew I would not forget the eyes, the still, patient stare waiting for the next wander to step too far into the field. The highway stretched endlessly. Mist rolled along the asphalt, thick and damp, pressing against the windshield. Road signs appeared and vanished, blurred into the fog. Headlights cut thin slices through the gray. The smell of wet tar and pine drifted in with each passing breeze. I drove slowly, every muscle tight, aware of the silence that swallowed everything outside the car. Flashes of light appeared along the roadside, pale, fleeting, almost like fireflies, but deliberate. Symbols, strange, jagged shapes etched in brightness. I blinked, and they were gone. Only fog and dark trees remained. Shadows moved at the edges of the lights. I thought I saw figures crouching behind guardrails, then vanished when I looked directly. It felt deliberate, like they were aware I was watching. The hum returned, low, metallic, vibrating through the tires, through the floorboards. It wasn't loud, but I felt it under my skin. The car felt alive, or the road itself. I slowed. The mist thickened, brushing against my arms and neck. The air tasted of damp asphalt and cold metal. I could feel the headlights slicing through fog, but the road ahead seemed to fold into itself, endless, repeating. Another symbol flickered, angular, pale, almost etched into the night. I caught a glimpse of movement behind it, soft, careful steps, or wind moving the mist. I couldn't tell. The tires rolled over wet patches. A faint rustling came from the roadside, branches bent too smoothly, shadows clinging to shapes that weren't there. Every time I tried to focus, the shapes dissolved into fog. The road signs changed, letters I didn't recognize, numbers that made no sense. They blinked in the headlights, then melted into the mist before I could read them. I leaned forward. The air smelled colder now, sharp with pine and something metallic. My chest felt heavy. The hum pulsed in time with my heartbeat. I could feel eyes, or the idea of eyes, trailing me from every shadow corner. A movement caught the edge of my vision. Something crouched by a guardrail. Still, watching. I blinked. It vanished. Nothing but fog and empty road remained. The highway curved endlessly. Each turn brought the same fog, the same flickering symbols, the same quiet, patient gaze from shadows I couldn't name. I wanted to turn back, but the road seemed to fold behind me, erasing where I had come from. I exhaled slowly. The mist brushed my face. The air was cold, damp, thick with anticipation. I could feel the hum fading slightly, but the unease lingered, dense, pressing against the windows. A final flash of light appeared along the roadside, a symbol, angular, bright. I slowed instinctively. It lingered just long enough to make me wonder if I had imagined it, then vanished in the fog, leaving only shadowed trees and endless asphalt. The road stretched ahead, unbroken. The fog swallowed everything else. I drove on, alone, and in the quiet heartbeat of the mist, I felt the road watching me back. The barn appeared suddenly, dark against the edge of the road, its silhouette swallowed by fog, wood warped and blackened, smelling of rot and rain-soaked earth. I stepped closer. The tires crunched over gravel and dead leaves. A hum lingered in the air, soft, low, vibrating through the soles of my boots. Not from the car, not mechanical. Somewhere else. The doors hung open, groaning slightly as the wind nudged them. Inside, shadows stretched across old tools, axes leaning against rusted nails, pitchforks caught in the dust. They bent and twisted in the dim light, shapes almost alive, almost reaching. The hum grew, not loud, not urgent, persistent, patient. It seemed to come from the rafters, from above, from nowhere. I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The smell of damp wood and old hay rose to meet me, thick, clinging to my clothes and skin. Every breath felt heavy, measured. Something moved, high above, in the shadows of the beams. A shift, a pause. The faintest brush of air like soft footsteps pacing the rafters. I froze. The hum held steady. Waiting, I ran my hand over a workbench. Cold metal tools, rough and biting under my fingers. Dust fell, floating in pale shafts of light through gaps in the boards. I felt watched. Every angle of the barn seemed to lean toward me. A shadow dipped from the rafters. Just a fraction. Enough to make my breath hitch. I looked up. Nothing. But the space above me seemed tighter, the darkness heavier. The hum changed pitch. A subtle vibration under the floorboards. The air smelled warmer now, thick with expectation, like the barn itself was holding its breath. I moved carefully. Each step made a soft echo, swallowed by shadow. Old ropes swayed gently as if someone or something had brushed against them. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but the air was still. A long, quiet rustling came from the rafters, soft, deliberate. It lingered just out of reach of my eyes. I could feel it above me, a presence patient, silent, waiting for me to notice. I reached for the door. The hum followed, wrapping around me like a pulse. The tools leaned closer in shadow. The floorboard seemed to tighten beneath my feet. I exhaled slowly. The barn held its silence after I stepped back outside. The fog wrapped around again, hiding the dark space in its folds. The hum receded, but the sense of being watched lingered. I stood for a moment, listening to the fog breathe around the structure, to the soft, patient rustling that remained somewhere inside. The barn was empty, and yet I could not shake the feeling that it remembered me. I walked back to the car. Every step carried the weight of unseen eyes. The hum had faded into distant memory, but the anticipation remained, quiet, lingering, like a whisper in the fog. Fog rolled in like water, thick and cold. It swallowed the fields and the road. Clinging to the car, to my skin, to my breath, red lights appeared on the horizon, dull at first, then sharper, blinking in patterns that made no sense. They weren't stars, not lanterns, not headlights, something else. The first blink came. A vibration hummed up through the tires, through the floor, into my chest. My heartbeat synced without warning, a shallow drum matching the rhythm of the distant lights. I blinked. The lights had shifted, impossible angles. They were moving with me, not behind, not ahead, but always in the corner of perception, just out of reach. The fog smelled damp and cold, sharp with wet soil and rusting metal. I could feel moisture on my arms, tiny beads forming along my hairline. The car moved slowly, deliberately, but the lights held pace, patient, unrelenting. Another blink. The vibration returned, echoing in my chest. I could feel it under my ribs, a soft pulse that made the hairs on my arms rise. The lights tilted slightly, like they were watching, considering, waiting. I swallowed. The air in the car was thick, metallic, sharp with anticipation. Every shadow outside stretched farther, leaning closer to the edges of the headlights. Something in the fog rustled. Soft, careful, patient. The road twisted. Each turn made the lights dance differently, following angles that didn't belong to the earth. My pulse raced. Not fast enough to escape. Not slow enough to calm. Just perfect for listening, for feeling, for knowing something was wrong. The vibration hummed again, through the floorboards, under my feet, through the steering wheel into my palms. My hands were damp, gripping tight. The red lights blinked again, and I felt each pulse in my chest, matching my own breath, my own heartbeat, like they were tied to me. The fog thickened, curling around the tires, the mirrors, the car itself. The smell of wet earth deepened, mingled with faint metallic tang. The lights hovered closer, not threatening, not moving fast, but deliberate, calculating, patient. I slowed, the tires barely rolling over asphalt. The lights blinked in sequence, almost like signals, almost like they were speaking in some rhythm I could not hear. The vibration softened, but my chest still throbbed in time with a distant red glow. I could feel the fog pressing against the car, leaning in, thickening the air, holding me still. Everything was quiet, except for the soft pulse beneath my ribs and the blinking, patient lights. I exhaled slowly. The fog wrapped around the headlights, turning the road into a pale, featureless ribbon. The lights lingered on the horizon, then tilted slightly, as if acknowledging me, before fading back into the mist. The vibration left a memory in my chest. The fog hung heavy. The road stretched on, alone, silent, waiting. I drove forward, and somewhere in the haze, I felt them still following, patient, deliberate, unblinking. Dusk settled across the fields. The sky was a pale gray, melting into shadows that stretched longer than they should. The air smelled of damp soil and dry grass, heavy and cold. A tractor sat at the edge of the field, idle, but it hummed faintly, a low vibration that tickled my chest. Not loud enough to be mechanical, but enough to make the air feel alive. I stepped closer. The gravel crunched under my boots. The hum persisted, soft, patient, threading through the wind and into my skin. Shadows leaned along the rows of crops, long, sharp, bending unnaturally. The tractor's metal gleamed pale in the fading light. Rust clung to its edges. I reached out, half expecting to feel the cold, solid surface. Instead, the vibration seemed to slip into my fingers, filling me with a quiet, strange anticipation. I turned my gaze back to the road behind me. The tractor should have stayed, should have remained still. But it didn't, or maybe it had vanished. The air thickened, holding the smell of wet earth and ozone. The hum pulsed faintly, matching the beat of my chest. I could feel my breath on my face, short and shallow, my hands gripping the jacket tighter. The shadows stretched longer, creeping along the field edges, and the hum seemed to grow, coaxing, patient. I blinked. When I looked back, the tractor was gone. Or maybe it had moved, but moved without sound, without reason. I took a step forward, mud squelching underfoot, the grass wet against my ankles. The vibration lingered, soft, almost hypnotic, drawing my eyes along the field line, expecting something, anything to appear. The tractor reappeared briefly in the corner of my vision, then vanished again. The dusk thickened, swallowing the horizon, making the field feel endless, like a corridor I had no way to escape. I inhaled the cold air, sharp against my throat. The hum softened, but it did not leave. Shadows shifted as though breathing, leaning closer, patiently observing each hesitant step I took. The soil smelled richer now, damp and turned, like it had been waiting. The grass pressed against my boots, wet and heavy. The horizon held only mist and darkening shadows, and the memory of the tractor's ghostly hum lingered in the air. I turned back toward the road. The asphalt stretched pale and empty through the fading light. The tractor was gone. Nothing remained but the fog, the hum echoing faintly in my chest, and the long, patient shadows bending into nothing. I walked back slowly. Every step left a wet imprint on the soil. The air smelled of earth and metal, and the field seemed to exhale softly behind me, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I didn't look back again. The road led onward, endless and quiet. But somewhere in the field, I knew the tractor still existed, moving or vanishing. In the fog, silent, patient, waiting. The road narrowed as I approached the station. Fog thickened around the tires, cold and damp against the car. The old building loomed, its paint flaking, windows dull and clouded. I stepped closer. The gravel shifted under my boots, and the air smelled of wet asphalt and rusting metal, thick with the scent of damp wood from the abandoned structure. Inside, the radio sat silent at first. Dust covered every surface. I turned the dial slowly. Static filled the air, humming low and vibrating under my skin. Then came whispers, soft, indecipherable, curling through the static. I leaned forward, breath shallow, but the whispers didn't come from the radio alone. They seemed to drift along the walls, weaving through the fog pressing against the windows. Lights flickered above, pale and irregular. They blinked in sync with the whispers, casting shifting shadows across the cracked floorboards and broken equipment. I walked slowly between the consoles. The hum of static lingered, soft, insistent, like the building itself was breathing. Each step pressed cold dust into the soles of my shoes. The whispers followed, patient, deliberate, curling around corners, lingering just beyond reach. The fog outside thickened. It clung to the glass, obscuring the road, the fields, everything beyond. I could smell wet earth through cracks in the windows, and the air inside carried a metallic tang, sharp and cold. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. I turned my head, slowly. Nothing, only pale light bending against the walls and the soft, endless whispering. The static pulsed with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. It vibrated to the floorboards, through the dust, and I could feel it in my chest, coaxing me to listen, to lean closer, to understand. I touched the radio. Cold, solid, heavy in my fingers. The whispers rose slightly, folding into the hum, wrapping around me, weaving into the thick, damp air. I stepped back. The lights flickered again, shadows stretching, twisting, reaching along the cracked walls. The fog pressed closer outside, and I felt eyes along every corner, watching, patient, silent. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my pulse. The whispers didn't stop, but they softened, weaving into the static hum. The air smelled of dust, wet wood, and something faintly metallic. The building seemed to hold its breath, as if it had waited for me to arrive. I turned toward the door. The fog swallowed the light behind me, and the shadows curled back into the corners. The whispers remained soft, patient, unyielding, like they had nowhere to go but into the silence of the night. Outside, the fog rolled over the road, and the station disappeared slowly into the mist. The static lingered in my ears, the hum in my chest, and I knew the building would remain, watching, waiting, whispering. I drove forward. The road stretched into gray silence. The fog followed, and somewhere behind me, the whispers continued, patient, soft, eternal. Moonlight spilled across the field, pale and cold. The barn loomed ahead, dark with gleaming faintly where the light caught it. The air smelled of damp hay and wet earth, heavy and still. I walked closer. Each step pressed soft into grass, wet and cold against my boots. The wind carried nothing but quiet, yet the air seemed to hum with anticipation, vibrating faintly against my chest. Above the barn, I saw it, a shape, hovering just beyond reach of light, silent, shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, its shadow stretching across the roof, bending the moonlight into impossible angles. I stopped, my heart hammered, loud in my ears. The grass brushed my hands as I steadied myself. Every instinct screamed to look away, but curiosity, sharp and cold, drew my gaze back. The shape moved again, deliberate, patient. Whenever I tried to focus, to pin it with my eyes, it retreated slightly, vanishing into the shadowed roofline. The air smelled sharper now, metallic with frost and damp wood. The hum pulsed softly through the ground beneath me, through the soles of my boots, and my breath caught in the cold, still night. Shadows from the rafters danced along the roof. They flickered with each movement of the shape, elongated, unnatural, twisting toward me. I blinked. It retreated. I swallowed. The barn seemed to exhale softly, pressing the fog around me, thick and close. I stepped forward. The grass bent wet and heavy underfoot. Every sense screamed, sight, touch, smell, even the faint vibration humming in the air. I could feel its presence, patient, observing, just out of reach. The moonlight shifted. Pale beams struck the roof, casting shadows that danced like fingers across the wood. The shape hovered just beyond the edge of the light, moving against expectation, slipping into corners when I looked directly. I breathed slowly. The cold pressed through my jacket. The air smelled of damp straw and frostbitten earth. The hum under my feet pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and I realized my own pulse had synchronized with the rhythm, meshing with something patient above me. I froze. The shape paused, almost as if waiting. Shadows stretched long along the barn, leaning closer, echoing the quiet anticipation that pressed around me. I exhaled softly, letting the fog swallow my sound. The shape shifted, sliding along the roof, careful, deliberate, never allowing my eyes to catch it fully. The barn smelled of old wood, of earth, of quiet decay. The hum persisted low, vibrating through the air, through my bones. I could feel eyes tracing every inch of me, patient, unblinking, waiting. I stepped back. The grass was wet against my ankles. The fog thickened around the barn. The shape lingered above, hovering just beyond comprehension, and I felt the silence press down, heavy and patient. I walked away slowly, hearing the soft rustle of wet grass underfoot. The barn receded into fog behind me. The shape remained, silent, deliberate, hovering in moonlight, waiting for the next witness to arrive. The ditch ran alongside the road, dark and narrow, reeds pressed close, damp and sharp against my fingers. The air smelled of wet earth, mud, and decaying leaves. A rustling came from inside, slow, deliberate, not random, not wind. Something moving, patient, waiting. The road behind me was empty. Fog curled low over the asphalt, clinging to the tires, the boots, the space between my steps. Each movement seemed louder than it should be. Pale light reflected off wet leaves, flickering and shifting as if alive. I leaned closer, eyes tracing the movement, and the rustling paused, then resumed. Patient, deliberate, I reached forward. The reeds brushed against my hands, cold and sharp. A damp smell rose, heavy, earthy, clinging. The rustling moved again, and I felt a presence just beyond reach, watching from the shadows. Shapes shifted among the reeds, tall, thin, bending with the wind, or perhaps against it. I blinked. They vanished. Only the echo of movement remained, a memory pressed into wet earth. The hum of the night seemed to settle in the ditch, soft, low, vibrating through the mud and reeds. My breath caught, shallow and measured. Every rustle echoed too long, stretching the silence into something heavier. I stepped back. The reeds whispered against each other, soft, careful, deliberate. The fog pressed closer, cold and damp, clinging to my jacket, my hair, my skin. I peered again. Nothing, only the faint reflection of pale light, glinting off wet leaves, casting shadows that seemed to twist and lean toward me. The rustling moved slightly, then paused, as if considering whether I was paying attention. A subtle vibration pulsed through the ground beneath my boots. The air smelled richer, of mud and decay, and I could feel the presence of something patient, just beyond the reeds, waiting. I exhaled slowly. The reeds swayed lightly, but no shapes appeared. Only the echo of movement remained, soft, deliberate, lingering in the fog. I walked back toward the road. The wet earth pressed cold and heavy under my boots. The ditch faded into shadow behind me, rustling softly in the silence. And somewhere in the reeds, I felt eyes watching, patient, quiet, unyielding. The road stretched on, empty, silent, but the memory of the rustling clung to the fog, a soft, lingering presence waiting for the next passerby. Twilight draped over the orchard. The trees bent strangely, gnarled branches twisting toward the ground and sky alike. The air smelled sweet and damp of earth and fallen apples, and something sharper, metallic, just under it. A pale glow drifted between the branches, soft, floating, almost alive. It moved deliberately, weaving through the shadows, casting faint light over twisted bark and wet leaves. I stepped carefully along the soft earth. The grass brushed damp against my ankles. Every breath came shallow, deliberate, catching faintly on the cool evening air. The orchard felt empty, yet I sensed presence, waiting, patient. A soft exhale met me from the shadows. Not loud, not threatening, but deliberate. The orchard held its silence, yet the sound curled through the trees like a whisper in my chest. The pale glow shifted again. It lingered among the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. Each shadow stretched unnaturally, leaning toward me, almost brushing my skin, though the space was empty. I leaned closer to one tree. The bark pressed cold and rough against my palms. The glow floated nearer, soft light touching the wet leaves, making them glisten like tiny mirrors in a half-light. The soft breathing continued, careful, measured. Every inhale seemed tied to the orchard itself, its rhythm synchronized with my own heartbeat, pulling me deeper into the misted rows of trees. A movement flickered at the edge of the glow. Branches swayed though there was no wind. Shadows shifted. I blinked. Nothing remained but the pale light hovering between trunks and the echo of soft, careful breaths. I stepped further. The air smelled of decay, wet apples, and cold moss. The glow draped over the orchard floor, twisting shapes in silver light, elongating the shadows, making the trees feel alive. My breath caught as I moved. Each step pressed softly into the damp soil. The glow paused, suspended between the branches, watching, patient. I sensed eyes I could not see, tracing my steps, careful, deliberate. I exhaled slowly. The orchard seemed to inhale with me, the pale glow stretching along trunks and leaves, reflecting faintly in the wet ground. The soft breathing continued, always nearby, yet never fully revealed. I turned back slowly. The orchard remained empty, yet the pale light drifted on, slow, deliberate, watching, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive. I walked away. The branches brushed against my jacket, damp and cold. The air smelled of earth and faint sweetness, and the soft breaths faded only slightly with each step. The orchard receded behind me, the pale glow lingering, a patient, quiet presence waiting in twilight, alone, eternal. Midnight pressed over the field. The grass was cold, damp against my boots. Fog rolled in low, curling around my ankles, thickening with every cautious step. The horizon held glimmers. Eyes? Lights? I could not tell. They shifted when I blinked, moving in time with my own careful pace. I stopped. The air smelled of wet earth, of frost, of something faintly metallic. My breath hung in the cold night, clouding, soft, hesitant. I felt, watched. The glimmers pulsed faintly. As I moved forward, I sensed a rhythm, a presence mirroring my steps, just beyond sight, patient, silent, deliberate. Grass pressed cold against my legs. Each rustle of leaves echoed in the fog, stretching the silence, pressing weight against the stillness of the field. I blinked. The lights shifted. Eyes? Reflections? I could not focus. Every glance made them retreat, slightly, always just out of reach. The fog thickened further. It clung to my jacket, to my hair, to the damp air. I inhaled slowly. The smell of wet soil and distant hay filled my senses. A soft vibration hummed beneath my feet, subtle, deliberate, like the field itself was breathing. I moved again. The glimmers followed. Careful, patient. Every step forward was echoed, every motion mirrored in the silent horizon. Shadows stretched long across the field. The fog softened their edges, but I could feel the presence moving just beyond perception, patient, unblinking, waiting. I stopped once more. The world narrowed to fog and the faint glimmering lights. My chest pulsed in sync with the rhythm beneath my boots, my breath shallow, trembling slightly against the cold. I sensed it there, always there, watching, mimicking, patient. I leaned slightly forward. The fog wrapped closer, pressing the scent of damp grass and soil against me. The lights on the horizon flickered in response, soft, deliberate, like the field itself held its breath. I exhaled slowly. The grass rustled against my boots. The fog drifted around me, and the glimmers pulsed faintly in time with my heartbeat. Every motion I made was tracked, mirrored, observed. The horizon stretched empty, yet alive. The field seemed to stretch endlessly, fog thickening, shadows bending, eyes, lights, glimmering, always patient, silent, unseen. I walked forward slowly. Each step pressed into wet earth, leaving faint impressions. The presence followed, careful, deliberate, unblinking. The fog swallowed the world behind me, and the glimmers lingered, waiting, patient, eternal. The field stretched on, alone, silent, cold, and I knew. Somewhere beyond sight, the watcher continued, mirroring, observing, its patience unbroken by night, by fog, by me. The road stretched into darkness, slick with mist. A rusted highway sign leaned crooked at the edge, pointing nowhere. The metal smelled sharp, oxidized, mingling with the damp fog that pressed against the windshield. Lights flickered along the road, pulsing in rhythm with the car. Each blink caught the edges of the fog, casting fleeting shadows across the asphalt, making the world feel unreal. I slowed. The tires pressed wetly against the slick road. Every turn of the wheel echoed, soft, deliberate, as though the road itself were breathing beneath me. The sign seemed to shift with each glance. Angles changed, though the road remained straight. Curves appeared unexpectedly, and I felt the car drifting, hesitant, as if the highway itself were alive. Fog pressed closer. It seeped through the seams of the door, cold and damp against my arms and face. The smell of wet asphalt and rusted metal mingled, sharp and heavy in the night that I blinked. The lights flickered again, and the road twisted in impossible ways. I could feel my pulse in the chest, matching the rhythm of the lights. My breath hung in the mist, shallow and cautious. The highway sign seemed to linger, its shadow stretching long and thin along the roadside. Yet every time I looked directly, it appeared smaller, farther away, a trick of light, or something patient, deliberate, waiting. The fog thickened with every turn. The curve of the road felt sudden, unexpected. The hum of the tires on wet asphalt vibrated through the car, soft, low, insistent. I felt displaced, disconnected from the familiar, as though the world had subtly shifted while I wasn't looking. The lights flickered again, casting brief, pale reflections along the windshield. I could see shadows bending along the roadside, leaning just out of reach, shifting with the rhythm of the faint pulse that seemed to follow the car. I exhaled slowly. The air smelled colder now, sharper with metal and damp earth. The sign remained patient, silent, pointing to nowhere. The road twisted again, and the fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. I drove on. The curves stretched longer. The shadows leaned closer, and the flickering lights continued, patient, deliberate, hypnotic. The world felt hollow, disoriented. The highway disappeared into fog. The sign lingered in memory, its rusted metal edges pale in the soft, pulsing light. The air pressed cold and wet against my skin, and I felt the road bending beneath me, silent, endless, waiting. The forest pressed close, dark shapes leaning into the damp night. Leaves trembled against the wind, soft, deliberate, brushing the air with wet whispers. A low hum drifted from above the canopy. It vibrated through the chest, through the soles of my boots. The sound was steady, patient, lingering between the trees, pressing against the fog. I paused. The forest smelled of damp bark and earth, of moss and rot, sharp and heavy beneath the pale moonlight. The hum persisted, steady, insistent. Lights hovered just beyond the branches, soft, flickering, unseen yet present, casting pale reflections on leaves wet with dew. They moved with a hum, drifting slowly, deliberately, unbound by wind or reason. Shadows twisted, not with the wind, not with any breeze I could feel, but contrary, bending against it, leaning toward me. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin prickle. I took a cautious step forward. The grass pressed damp and soft beneath my boots. The hum seemed to follow, vibrating in time with my heartbeat. Slow, insistent, impossible to ignore. The leaves quivered above. Branches bent low, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach. I could smell the cold damp of the night, the faint metallic tang of something hidden. The lights shifted, hovering, drifting, careful, as if studying me, patient and unseen. Every time I tried to follow them with my eyes, they moved against expectation, bending the shadows, altering the fog. I exhaled slowly. The hum vibrated faintly under my skin. The forest held its silence around it, listening, waiting, every rustle of leaves magnified in the stillness. I stepped further, careful, deliberate. The fog pressed against my jacket, clinging to hair and arms. The humming pulsed faintly in time with the soft creak of branches, echoing across the forest canopy. Shadows leaned closer. Leaves quivered. The lights drifted higher, hovering just beyond reach, reflecting faintly on wet leaves, illuminating nothing else. I swallowed. The air smelled damp, earthy, metallic, and the soft pressed against my chest. The forest seemed endless, yet everything moved with intent, watching, quiet, patient. I stepped back. The lights remained, drifting above the trees. The shadows twisted, bending against wind and reason. The hum lingered, soft and deliberate, pulling the night closer, folding the fog around me. I walked away slowly. The wet grass pressed soft against my boots, the fog swallowing each step. Above, the hum continued, and the lights hovered, silent, patient, unyielding. The forest waited. The air changed in late October. It grew cold, not with the chill of autumn, but with a damp, heavy weight. I was driving home from work, taking the long way through the old farm roads, the kind of roads where your headlights are the only light for miles, where the darkness feels complete. That's when I first saw it, a wall of white, rolling across the harvested cornfields. It didn't move like normal fog. It came in waves, like a slow, silent tide. I slowed the car to a crawl. My tires whispered on the wet asphalt. The world outside, my windshield dissolved. It was just me, and this pale, swallowing stillness. I rolled the window down. The air smelled electric, like the moment after a lightning strike. And there was a hum, a low, steady vibration you felt more than heard. It was in your teeth, at the base of your skull. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. I couldn't see to drive. I just sat there, engine off, listening to the absolute silence, watching the fog press against the glass. That's when I saw the first shape, a darker gray in the endless white, tall and thin. It moved past my passenger side window, a slow, deliberate glide. Then it was gone, swallowed by the pale. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was a fence post, a trick of the light, my eyes straining for something to fix on. But then another one appeared, further out in the field. This one stopped. It seemed to turn, a shift in the density of the fog, a suggestion of a form facing me. I held perfectly still. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, watching from a void. And then, as softly as it formed, it bled away, back into the nothingness. I started to see the pattern then. They weren't random. The shapes emerged and vanished in a rhythm, like a slow, coordinated dance. One would appear near the road, then another deep in the field, then a third further still. They were tracing a path, a route only they could see. They moved with a purpose, a silent, patient intelligence. This was not weather. This was not some natural phenomenon. This fog was a veil, and something was walking behind it. I saw one then, closer than any before, just a few feet from my side mirror. It was the outline of a person, but stretched and wrong. Its head was tilted. It had no face, just a smooth, gray expanse where features should be. It raised a long, slender arm. Not a wave, not a threat, just a slow, deliberate lift. Acknowledgement. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look at it. The hum grew louder inside my head, a static filling my thoughts. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. The fog was beginning to pull back, the waves receding from the road, revealing the broken corn stalks, the black, wet earth. The world was coming back, but it felt different now, tainted. I looked into the thinning mist. For a moment, I saw them all, a dozen, maybe more of those tall, slender forms, standing in a perfect line at the edge of the field, all facing the road, all facing me. Then the fog lifted one final time, and the line was empty, just a memory etched into the air. I started the car. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze. Every shadow in the ditch seemed to shift as I passed. Every street lamp looked like a pale, watching eye. I pulled into my driveway. The night was clear now, Stars pepper the sky. A normal, quiet night. I walked to my front door, fumbled for my keys, and as I stepped inside, I caught a scent on my jacket, that same electric damp, and I felt a faint, low hum, still buzzing in my bones. A quiet reminder that the fog doesn't just leave. Some of it follows you home. The gravel road to my house is a long, lonely ribbon. It cuts through empty fields that stretch out to meet a flat, gray sky. This was early November, the time of year when the light fades early, leaving the world in a deep blue twilight. And lining this road, for as long as I can remember, was the old fence. A split-rail fence, weathered silver by decades of sun and rain. It was a constant, a familiar marker on the journey home. I was walking that night. My car was in the shop. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. My footsteps were the only sound. A steady crunch, crunch on the loose gravel. I'd walk a few paces, then glance to my right. The fence stood there, a silent wooden soldier, its posts marching away into the growing dark. I walked a little further. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. A faint, cold sensation trickled down my spine. I stopped, looked back the way I came. The fence was still there, but there was a gap, a space between two posts where the middle rail was missing. I was sure it had been whole just a moment ago. I stared at that empty space, a black rectangle opening into the field beyond. It felt like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. Wrong. I shook my head, kept walking, told myself I was just tired, that I'd never really memorized every inch of this fence. But my pace quickened. The gravel crunched louder under my shoes. After a dozen steps, I stole another look back. This time, my breath froze in my lungs. Another gap, wider this time. 2 whole sections of rail were just gone. The post stood alone, useless sentinels in the gloom. The gaps were perfect. No broken wood on the ground. No sign of a fall. It was as if the rails had never been there at all. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I started walking faster. No longer a stroll, a retreat. My heart began to beat a dull, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't stop myself from looking back again. And again. Each time, another piece was missing. The fence was being erased, swallowed by the twilight, piece by piece. It was then I saw the lights, beyond where the fence should have been, out in the middle of the vast, empty field. Small, pale orbs of light. They hovered just above the ground, drifting slowly. They weren't fireflies. This was a cold, steady light, like distant stars falling to earth. I stopped walking completely. Transfixed, one of the lights pulsed softly. It seemed to beckon. A deep, illogical part of me wanted to go to it, to step through one of those new, empty gaps and walk into field, to find the source of that gentle, impossible glow. I took a single step off the road. My shoes sank into the soft, wet soil, and in that instant all the lights winked out, not like they were extinguished, like they were never there. The field was just a black, empty sea. The silence felt heavier now, pressing on my ears. I stumbled back onto the gravel, turned and almost ran. I didn't look back again. I just focused on the distant yellow glow of my porch light. My throat was tight. My skin was cold and clammy. I finally reached my gate, fumbled with the latch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work it. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaned against it, breathing hard. The house was silent, warm, normal. I went to the kitchen window, peered out into the night, towards the road. I couldn't see the fence from here, just darkness. But then, a single, pale light flickered in the distance, right where my property line meets the road. It hovered for a moment, a tiny, watching eye in the vast dark. Then it vanished, and I was left with a new, chilling certainty. The fence wasn't being erased. It was being cleared away to make room for something else, something that was getting closer. The old wooden dock was my place to think, to escape the closed-in feeling of the house. It was late November now. The cold was sharper. It bit at my ears and the tip of my nose. The lake was a sheet of black glass, perfectly still, reflecting a sliver of moon and a handful of brave stars. I sat at the end of the dock, my legs dangling over the edge. The wood was cold, even through my jeans. The only sound was a gentle lap of water against the pilings, a rhythm as old as the earth. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and wet stone. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. Then I looked down, into the water, at the reflection of the moon. It was wrong. The reflection wasn't a clean, sharp sliver. It was blurred, smeared, as if someone had dragged a thumb through the silver light. I leaned forward, squinting. The ripples from the dock shouldn't have done that. The water around the moon's image shimmered, not with the natural movement of water, but with a slow, oily swirl. The pale light twisted and coiled on the dark surface, forming patterns that made no sense, spirals that tightened then unraveled. My own reflection was there too, a dark, distorted version of my face, staring back up at me from the deep. A chill, deeper than the night air, settled into my bones. I lifted my gaze from the water, looked out across the lake. That's when I saw them, the shapes. They hovered just above the center of the lake, dark smudges against the slightly lighter sky. They had no form I could name, no wings, no limbs. They were just concentrations of shadow, hanging in the air, utterly still. I couldn't tell how big they were. Distance on the water at night is a liar. They could have been the size of birds, or the size of cars. They simply floated, silent. I felt the air change. It grew thick, heavy. It was hard to pull a full breath into my lungs. The gentle lapping of the water against the dock slowed, then stopped completely. The world fell into an absolute, unnatural silence. Not a single cricket chirped. Not a single frog croaked. The woods at the lake's edge were a wall of black, holding its breath. That's when I felt it, the weight of attention. Something was watching, not from the woods, not from the sky. It felt like it was watching from everywhere at once, from the water below me, from the air around me, from the very darkness between the stars. My skin prickled. Every hair on my body stood on end. A pressure began to build behind my eyes. A low, internal hum filled my head, the same hum I'd felt in the fog. The shapes over the water began to drift, not flying, gliding. They moved towards each other, merging, separating. A slow, silent dance I wasn't meant to understand. One of them drifted closer to the shore, closer to the dock. As it moved, the water beneath it didn't ripple. It didn't react at all. The shadow passed over the reflection of the moon, and the smeared, silver light went out, snuffed like a candle. The patch of water was just a void, a hole cut into the world. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was pinned in place by that immense, watching presence. The shadow hovered, maybe 50 feet from the end of the dock. I felt a coldness radiate from it, a deep, spatial cold that had nothing to do with the November air. It was studying me. I could feel its focus, a needle of attention pressed against my skin. Then, as silently as it had come, it retreated, gliding back to the center of the lake. The moon's reflection flickered back to life on the water. The lapping sound returned. A tentative lap, then another. The crushing weight in the air lessened. I could breathe again. I scrambled back from the edge of the dock. My hands were numb with cold and fear. I didn't look back at the lake. I ran, up the path to my house, my heart hammering in my chest. I burst through the back door, locked it, leaned against it, gasping. I went to the kitchen sink. My hands were still shaking. I ran the tap, splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the feeling of being watched. I looked up into the small mirror above the sink, and in the reflection of the dark window behind me, I saw it, a single dark smudge, hovering just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. Then it was gone, and I was left with the terrible knowledge. It hadn't stayed at the lake. Some of the darkness had followed me home. The old Miller farm has stood empty for years, but every spring the fields are still planted. No one ever sees a farmer. The corn just appears. By December it was bone dry, a golden fortress taller than a man. I was walking the dirt track that borders it. The setting sun bled orange across the sky. The air was perfectly still, frozen, and yet the corn was moving, not in a windswept wave, but in isolated patches. A cluster of stalks would shiver 20 yards away. Then another would rustle directly to my left. Then another far ahead. It was a staggered, broken rhythm, like something was moving through the rows. Parallel to me, I stopped walking. The dry, dusty smell of corn filled my nose. The rustling stopped the moment I did. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. I took a hesitant step forward. The gravel crunched under my boot, and from the heart of the corn a whisper. It was too soft to make out words, just a sibilant hiss, like pages of a book rubbing together. My blood went cold. I stood utterly still, straining to listen. It came again, from my right this time, a different texture, softer. Then another from directly behind me. This one was closer. I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. Soon, they were coming from everywhere. A chorus of soft, overlapping voices. None of them spoke words I could understand. It was a language of sighs and hushed secrets. The sound wove through the dry stalks, a tapestry of quiet noise. It felt like they were talking about me, discussing me in their silent, rustling language. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the dirt. The whispers seemed to press in from all sides, a physical pressure against my skin. Then I saw the lights, small pinpricks of pale gold. They appeared deep within the cornfield. They pulsed, not randomly, in a rhythm, a slow, steady beat, like a distant, silent heart. One would glow brightly, then fade. As it faded, another would appear a few rows over. Then another. They were dancing, weaving through the stalks in time with the whispers. The rustling started again, more purposeful now. The stalks parted not 10 feet from where I stood. Something was coming towards the edge of the field, coming towards me. The whispers grew more intense, more focused. The lights pulsed faster, their golden glow flickering through the narrow gaps between the stalks. I could see a shadow moving within the corn, a tall, slender darkness shifting behind a golden veil. I took a stumbling step backward. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. The whispers rose to a soft, urgent crescendo. It sounded like pleading, like a warning. The shadow at the edge of the field stopped. The rustling ceased. The lights all dimmed at once. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence, and the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. Then a single, final whisper. It came from right in front of me, so close I could feel the breath of it on my face. This time, I understood it. It was one word. My name. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The sound of my own frantic footsteps was the only thing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my porch. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking violently. I slammed the door shut, locked it, leaned against the wood, gasping for air. My whole body was trembling. I went to the window, peered out into the deepening twilight. The cornfield was a dark, silent mass in the distance, perfectly still. But as I watched, a single pale light pulsed once, a slow, deliberate flash from the exact spot where I had been standing. Then it went dark, and the night was still once more. I knew then with a cold certainty, the corn wasn't just a plant. It was a living, breathing thing, and it knew my name. The decision to drive was a mistake. I knew at the moment I turned onto Blackstone Lane. It was the only way home from my sister's house. A narrow, winding cut through ancient pine forests. Tonight, a thick mist had settled in. It pooled in the hollows of the land. My headlights carved 2 weak tunnels in the gloom. The world was reduced to the asphalt directly in front of my tires, and a wall of white beyond. The pine trees on either side were just dark suggestions, fingers of shadow pointing at a sky I could no longer see. I drove slowly. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The only sound was the hum of my engine, and the soft swish of my wipers pushing moisture across the glass. I glanced in my rear-view mirror. Nothing, just a solid wall of fog. The road I had just traveled was gone, erased. It was as if it had never existed. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I focused ahead, drove a little faster. The yellow line in the center of the road was my only guide, my lifeline. I followed its gentle curve, my eyes fixed on its fading glow. Then it was gone. The yellow line just stopped, swallowed by the mist. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt on the wet asphalt. Silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. My high beams clicked on. They didn't help. The light just reflected back at me. A solid, blinding white. There was no road, no trees, no sky, just an endless, pale void. I was adrift, a ship in a silent, motionless sea. I put the car in park. The click of the gear shift was unnaturally loud. I rolled my window down. The air was cold and damp. It smelled of wet pine and something else, something metallic, like old coins. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no distant owls, no wind in the trees. It was a dead, hollow quiet. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound, ahead of the car, in the place where the road should be. It was a sound of something moving through dry undergrowth, a slow, deliberate shuffle. My breath caught in my throat. I stared into the impenetrable white. I saw nothing, but the sound continued. A scrape, then a drag, then another scrape. It was getting closer. My hands were trembling. I fumbled for the button to roll up the window. The electric, there was a scream in the silence. The rustling stopped. I held my breath. The silence felt heavier now, watchful. I could feel a presence out there, just beyond the reach of my lights. Something standing in the non-space where my road had been, waiting. A soft thump landed on my roof. A single, heavy drop. Then another. Then a third. It wasn't rain. It was too solid, too deliberate. Thump, 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 like someone was gently tapping the metal above my head. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look at the white nothingness anymore. I couldn't listen to the soft, patient footsteps on my car. I focused on the hum of the engine, the feel of the leather steering wheel under my hands. Anything real. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. A faint, gray line on the asphalt, just a few feet ahead. The yellow center line. It was back. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the car into drive and pressed the accelerator. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before gripping. The car lurched forward. The thumping on the roof ceased. The wall of fog seemed to part, just enough to reveal the narrow, winding road. I didn't look in the rear-view mirror. I didn't slow down. I just drove, following the yellow line as if my life depended on it. When I finally saw the warm, familiar lights of my house, I almost cried with relief. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, sat there for a long time, just breathing. I got out. My legs were weak. I looked back down the road. The fog was just normal fog now, hanging over the fields, thin and harmless. I walked to my front door. My keys jangled in my shaking hand. As I stepped inside, I glanced up at the roof of my car. There, in the thin layer of moisture, were 3 perfect, clean circles, as if something with wet, circular feet had stood there, watching me, waiting for me to move. The old farmhouse is full of windows. At night, they become black mirrors. I was in the kitchen making tea. The only light was a single bulb over the stove. It cast a weak yellow glow. Outside, the December darkness was complete. I stood at the sink, waiting for the water to boil. My own reflection stared back at me from the window, pale, tired. The bags under my eyes looked like bruises. I looked past my reflection, into the absolute black of the night. That's when I saw it. Another face. It was faint, superimposed over the darkness behind my own reflection. It was tall, thin. Its features were smoothed over, like a statue worn down by rain. Where its eyes should have been were 2 soft, silver smudges. A cold stillness settled in the room. The hum of the refrigerator faded away. The only sound was the quiet hiss of the heating kettle. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The face in the window didn't either. It just hung there in the blackness, a silent observer. The silver smudges where its eyes should be, they seemed to be looking past my reflection, looking directly at me. My reflection was just a ghost in the way, a piece of glass it was looking through. I took a slow, shaky step to the side. My reflection moved with me. The other face did not. It remained, fixed in the center of the window. Now it was staring at a blank space on my kitchen wall. The kettle began to scream, a sharp, piercing whistle that shattered the silence. I jumped. My heart leaped into my throat. I fumbled to turn off the stove. The whistle died, leaving a ringing in my ears. I looked back at the window. The face was gone. The window was just a black mirror again, showing only my own frightened expression. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding. My hands were trembling. It was just my mind playing tricks. Stress, fatigue. I told myself that as I poured the hot water. The steam warmed my face. I carried my mug into the living room, sat in my armchair, tried to forget the smooth, featureless face, the silver eyes. I took a sip of tea, and my gaze drifted to the large picture window, the one that looks out onto the front porch. My breath caught. There were shapes out there, 3 of them, tall and slender. They stood perfectly still on the lawn, just beyond the porch light's reach. They glowed with a faint, internal light, a pale, sickly green, like foxfire on rotten wood. I couldn't see any details, just their outlines against the deeper dark, and the same soft, silver smudges where their faces should be. They weren't moving. They weren't looking at each other. All 3 sets of those silver eyes were fixed. On the window, on me, the warmth of the mug in my hands felt meaningless. A tiny comfort against the immense cold of their gaze. I felt a pressure in the air, a silent, heavy attention. It was the same feeling I'd had at the lake, but stronger now, more focused. They were studying me, the way a scientist studies a specimen in a jar. I sat there, frozen. The tea grew cold in my hands. Minutes stretched. The shapes did not move. They made no sound. They were statues of faint, green light, silent sentinels in my yard. Then, as one, they turned, a slow, unified movement. They glided away, their faint light fading as they moved towards the tree line. They didn't walk. They simply drifted over the frozen ground and vanished into the shadows of the pines. The pressure in the room lifted. I could breathe again. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty lawn, the quiet, normal night. Finally, I stood. My joints were stiff with cold and fear. I walked to the front door, locked it, pulled the deadbolt with a solid, heavy thunk. I went around the first floor, checking every window, making sure every latch was secure. When I returned to the kitchen, I avoided looking at the window over the sink. I didn't need to see my reflection. I didn't need to see what might be looking back from the other side. I left the mug in the sink, the tea untouched, and I climbed the stairs to bed, knowing, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that the windows weren't keeping anything out. They were just letting them look in. I finally had to admit I wasn't sleeping. The night was a living thing, and it called to me. I found myself standing on the back porch. The wooden planks were icy under my bare feet. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. A low fog had settled in the valley below my house. It looked like a still, gray lake, and above the line of pine trees at the edge of my property, it drifted, a shape. It was difficult to look at directly. My eyes wanted to slide away, to focus on the stars around it. It was a tear in the fabric of the night, a void that was somehow full. It had no edges I could define. It was a darkness that pulsed with a soft, deep light, a deep violet glow, like a bruise on the sky. It moved without moving, drifting silently, effortlessly. It made no sound. The world was utterly hushed, as if holding its breath. I realized my own breath was caught in my chest. I let it out in a white cloud, and as I did, the violet glow within the shape pulsed, a slow, gentle throb of light. My heart beat once, a heavy, solid knock against my ribs. The shape pulsed again, in perfect time. I placed a hand over my chest, feeling the rhythm, thump, pulse, thump, pulse. My heartbeat and the light were one, a synchronized drum in the silent night. A wave of dizziness washed over me. It wasn't fear. It was something else, a profound, dizzying connection. This thing in the sky, it was tied to me, to the very rhythm of my life. The fog below began to stir. It wasn't moving with the wind. There was no wind. It swirled upwards. Long, graceful tendrils of mist rising from the gray lake. They curled around a hovering shape, caressing it, embracing it. The fog wasn't hiding it. It was honoring it, protecting it. The violet light pulsed through the tendrils of fog, lighting them from within. A beautiful, terrible aurora in miniature. I felt a pull, a deep, magnetic draw from the center of my being. My feet felt rooted to the porch, but my mind felt like it was floating upwards, drawn toward that silent, pulsing heart. I wanted to be closer, to understand, to step into that light and let it fill me. The thought should have terrified me, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The only thing. The shape began to drift closer. Slowly, smoothly, it moved over pine trees. The tips of the trees seemed to bend away from it, not from wind, from a gentle, unseen pressure. The fog swirled more urgently around it, a living cloak. The violet light grew brighter. The pulses came faster. My heart kept pace, a frantic, racing rhythm. Thump, thump, pulse, pulse, thump, thump, pulse, pulse. I could feel the light in my veins, a static buzz in my blood. The shape was now directly above my house. It blocked out the stars. A vast, silent, pulsing presence. It felt ancient and infinitely patient. It hovered there for a long moment. It simply was, and I simply was with it, connected. Then, as slowly as it had come, it began to rise. The tendrils of fog fell away, dissolving back into the night. The violet light dimmed. The pulses slowed. My own heartbeat eased back to its normal rhythm. The shape shrank, becoming just a dark smudge against the stars. Then a pinprick. Then nothing. The sky was just a sky again. The fog was just fog. The silence was just silence. I stood there for a long time. My bare feet were numb with cold. My body felt hollow, drained. I looked down at my hands. They seemed ordinary, but I could still feel it. A faint, lingering hum in my chest. A new, quiet rhythm beneath my own heartbeat. A ghost pulse. A reminder that I was no longer just myself. I was connected to something else. Something that was now gone, but would be back. I was sure of it. It had found me, and now it knew exactly where I lived. The thaw came suddenly. A day of week. December sun turned the world to mud. The path to my woodshed was a mess of soft, black earth. I needed more wood for the stove. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and decay. I pulled my boots on and stepped outside. The mud was thick. It sucked at my soles with every step. That's when I saw them. The tracks. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrow with no tread, just smooth, oval depressions in the mud. They led from the edge of the woods, across the path, and stopped right in the middle of the clearing. They didn't continue on the other side. They just ended, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into the air. A cold prickle ran down my spine. I looked around. The woods were silent, dripping. I took a cautious step forward. My boot sank into the mud with a wet squelch. At the same moment, a pale light flickered, deep between the trees. A brief blue-white flash. Then darkness. I froze. My heart was a tight knot in my chest. I took another step. Squelch. Another flicker of light in the same spot. A perfect silent response. I began to walk slowly towards a woodshed, my eyes fixed on the tree line. With every footfall to flicker. Step. Flicker. Step. Flicker. It was keeping pace with me. An unseen companion matching my rhythm. The lights weren't random. They were answers. I reached the woodshed. My hand was trembling as I lifted the latch. The old wooden door groaned open. I grabbed an armful of split logs. The bark was rough and damp against my jacket. I turned to go back, and that's when I heard it. Another set of footsteps. They weren't mine. They were softer, a gentle, squelching sound in the mud, coming from the other side of the shed, from the exact direction of the flickering lights. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath. The footsteps continued, Step, squelch. Step, squelch. They were mimicking my own pace, my own path, walking parallel to me, just out of sight. I could feel a presence there, just beyond the rough-hewn wall of the shed. Something unseen moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I clutched the firewood to my chest. The damp cold of the wood seeped through my clothes. I took a hesitant step forward. The unseen footsteps did the same. I took another. So did they. We walked in sync. A terrible, silent dance. I could hear them perfectly now. The soft, wet sound of steps in mud. Always just a few feet away. Always hidden. A wave of dizzying isolation washed over me. I was not alone in my yard, but I had never felt more completely by myself. I picked up my pace, almost jogging. The footsteps matched me instantly. A faster, softer squelching rhythm. The lights in the trees flickered rapidly. A frantic, strobing pulse. I burst out of the path and onto the gravel driveway. The sound of my boots on stone was loud and sharp. The footsteps in the mud stopped. The flickering lights went out. The woods were silent again. Just the drip, drip of water from branches. I stood there, panting, my heart hammering. I looked down at the mud where the unseen thing had walked. There were no new tracks, just the same smooth, empty depressions, leading nowhere. I hurried inside, locked the door, dumped the wood by the stove. My hands were shaking. I went to the kitchen window, looked out at the path. The mud was churned up from my frantic run, but beside my own deep boot prints was a second set of prints, the same smooth, featureless ovals. They walked alongside mine, step for step. They started at the edge of the woods, and they ended right at my doorstep. It appeared over the distant hills just after sunset. A single, steady point of white light. It wasn't a star. Stars don't hover just above the tree-line. It wasn't a plane. It was perfectly still. I stood at my bedroom window, watching it. The last of the day's light was a deep, bruised purple in the west. The light was a constant, a silent beacon in the growing dark. It was beautiful in a strange, lonely way, a companion in the vast, empty night. I found myself leaning against the cold glass, my breath fogging the pain. I didn't feel afraid. Not at first. I felt a quiet wonder. What was it? Why was it there? It seemed to pulse, ever so slightly. A gentle rhythm, like a slow, sleeping heart. I watched it for what felt like a long time. The room behind me grew dark. The only illumination was that distant, pale glow. Then, without warning, it vanished. It didn't fade. It didn't drift away. It was just gone, swallowed whole by the night. One moment it was there, a fixed point in the universe. The next, nothing. Just an empty blackness where it had been. A cold hollow opened in my chest. The world felt unbalanced, wrong. As I stared at the empty spot, the fog began to roll in. It crept across the fields below, a slow, silent tide of white. It was thicker than any fog I had ever seen. Dense, opaque. It moved with a purpose, swallowing the dark shapes of the landscape. The silence in the room deepened. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy, listening quiet. The old house usually creaked and settled. Now it was utterly still. I could hear the soft rush of blood in my own ears. I could hear the faint, dry click of my eyelids blinking. And I could hear my own breath, a shallow, hesitant rhythm in the dead air. In and out, a small, fragile sound in the immense stillness. The fog reached the edge of my property. It didn't stop. It slid over my fence, a slow, relentless wave. It began to obscure the trees in my yard, turning them into gray ghosts, then shapeless shadows, then nothing at all. The world outside my window was being erased, replaced by a uniform, pale gray. The silence pressed against the glass. It felt like the fog was absorbing all sound, all life. I took a step back from the window. The floorboard creaked under my foot. The sound was shockingly loud. A gun shot in the quiet. I froze, waiting, holding my breath. The fog was right up against the house now. I could see nothing but a solid wall of white. It was like being inside a cloud. completely isolated, cut off from everything. The only thing that was real was the sound of my own breathing and the frantic beating of my own heart. I reached out a hand, touched the cold glass of the window. The fog was so thick, I couldn't even see my own reflection, just a blur of white. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, watching the nothingness. The wonder I had felt was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing unease. The light hadn't just gone out, it had been taken, and the fog that replaced it, it felt like a curtain being drawn, hiding something, or someone. I finally pulled the curtains shut. The room felt a little safer, a little more real, but as I turned away, I could still feel the silence out there, pressing in, waiting, and I knew with a cold certainty, the vanishing of the light wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The stage was now clear, and something else was about to take its place. I've driven this road 10,000 times. The last bend before the straightaway home. I know every crack in the asphalt, every leaning fence post. But tonight, something was wrong. The bend was sharper, tighter than it should be. My headlights swept across the guardrail, and the shadows they cast, they didn't behave right. They stretched, long, thin fingers of darkness that reached for the center line. They seemed to cling to the road, liquid and thick. As I rounded the curve, the shadows twisted. They slid across the pavement against the light, a physical impossibility. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. My hands gripped the steering wheel. The familiar woods on my right were just a black wall. Then a light appeared, not on the road, but deep within the trees. A sickly, greenish glow. It hung at a strange angle, tilted, as if the world itself was crooked. It pulsed once, a slow, deliberate throb. Then it was gone. I stared at the spot where it had been. My heart thudded against my ribs. Another light flickered. This one was ahead of me, hovering over the road itself. A pale blue-white orb. It wasn't a car light. It had no source, no beam. It just existed. It drifted sideways, moving against the direction of the wind. Then it simply winked out of existence, like a switch had been flipped. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield. The air in the car felt heavy, cold. I accelerated, wanted to be home, wanting to be off this distorted stretch of road. My headlights illuminated a road sign, the one that says my street name is 1 mile ahead. The letters were blurred. The metal was warped, as if it had melted and resolidified in the wrong shape. A shadow detached itself from the base of the sign. It was tall, impossibly thin. It didn't walk. It slid, a smooth, gliding motion that carried it across the road in seconds. It passed directly through my headlight beams, and for a moment I saw it clearly. It had no depth. It was a cutout, a two-dimensional silhouette painted on the air. Then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness on the other side. I pressed the gas pedal harder. The engine groaned. The trees along the roadside seemed to lean in, their branches clawing at the edge of the light. The world felt thin, like a fragile skin over something else, something that was starting to show through. Had the world always been like this? Had I just never noticed? Or had it shifted, twisted itself into this new, wrong shape just for me? The straightaway should have been right there, but the road just kept curving. A gentle, endless bend that promised no end. A quiet panic began to bloom in my chest. This was my road. I knew it, but it didn't know me anymore. A final light appeared in my rear-view mirror. A single red point of light. It hovered just behind my car, matching my speed. It didn't illuminate the road around it. It was just a solitary, watching eye. I couldn't look away from it. My own speed slowed without me realizing. The red light grew closer, larger. Then, with a sudden lurch, the road straightened. The familiar line of mailboxes appeared, the shadowy shapes of my neighbors' houses. I glanced in the mirror. The red light was gone. I turned onto my street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the wheel. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, sat in the sudden, absolute silence. I looked back down the road. It was just a road again, a normal, dark country lane, but the feeling lingered, the deep, unsettling dread. The world had shifted, just a little, enough to let the wrongness in. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, it wouldn't shift back. I left the car at the end of the driveway. The engine had been making a sound I didn't like, a low, rattling hum that felt too familiar. The walk to my front door has never felt so long. The night was cold. Still, a thin, greasy fog clung to the ground, wrapping around the bases of the trees. It didn't drift. It just stayed, hugging the earth, and behind the trees the glow. A faint, greenish light that seemed to pulse with a slow, patient rhythm. It wasn't the moon. The moon was a sharp, white sliver high above. This light was earthbound. It moved when I moved, keeping pace with me. A silent companion, just beyond the tree line. I kept walking. My footsteps on the gravel were the only real sound. Each crunch seemed too loud, an announcement of my presence. Every rustle in the dry winter grass was amplified, a tiny explosion in the silence. I could feel the weight of observation. It was a physical pressure on the back of my neck, a cold spot between my shoulder blades. Something was watching from that glow, from the fog, from the spaces between the branches. I didn't run. What was the point? It had followed me from the fields, from the lake, from the distorted road. It wasn't going to be outrun. This was its place as much as mine now. The fog thickened around my ankles. It felt cold and damp through my socks. I'd left my boots in the car. The mistake felt trivial, meaningless. The glow brightened slightly, as if it appreciated my realization. I passed the old oak tree. Its bare branches were a tangled web against the sky. For a moment, the glow silhouetted a shape within those branches, long, limbed, perched, perfectly still. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look directly at it. I just acknowledged it with a slow, tired blink. It was there. Of course it was there. The rustling in the grass came again, closer this time, just a few feet to my left. I could hear the dry stems breaking under a weight that wasn't mine. I kept my eyes fixed on my front porch, the warm, yellow light of the lamp I'd left on. It seemed a million miles away, a tiny, futile beacon in an ocean of wrongness. The glow behind the trees began to shift. It wasn't just following me parallel anymore. It was angling inward, converging on my house. On me, the fog swirled around my knees now. A chilly, clinging embrace. My breath plumed in the air, mixing with the mist. I reached my porch steps. The wooden planks were solid and real under my feet. I paused at the top, my hand on the cool metal of the railing. I turned and looked back. The glow had reached the edge of my lawn. It pulsed softly from the deep shadow under pines. I could see no source, no form, just the light itself, holding steady, watching. The rustling in the grass had stopped. The world was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, a waiting silence. I looked at that soft green glow. I looked at the fog coiling on my lawn. I looked at the familiar shape of my dark car at the end of the drive, and I understood. This wasn't a pursuit anymore. It wasn't a hunt. It was an arrival. I had been the path, and it had reached its destination. I turned my back on it. I opened my front door, stepped inside into the warmth and the light. I didn't lock the door. I closed it softly. I went to the window and looked out. The glow was still there, a soft green ember in the night, a permanent fixture, a new part of the scenery. It wasn't going to attack. It wasn't going to break down the door. It was just going to be there, just out of reach, a presence on the perimeter, a quiet, glowing truth in the dark. I pulled the curtains shut. The room felt both safer and more fragile, a lit cage and accepting wild. I stood there in the quiet of my own home, listening, and from just outside the window, I heard a soft, slow rustle against the siding, a gentle, patient sound, and I knew it was never, ever going to leave